Hello everyone and welcome to Taiwan Talks, covering the latest global news analysis from a Taiwan perspective. I'm Gladys.
I'm Rath, Wang.
1 year into Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we look at what this means for the global war against authoritarianism.
Coming up, Hanna Hopko, former Ukrainian MP, speaks to us from the war zone.
More than 90% believe that we are winning and we must win, and this is our mission to defeat Russian imperialism, and this is the key for global democracy.
We then discuss authoritarian ambition from Russia to China.
Vincent Chao, former political director at Taiwan's mission to the U.S., then tells us how Taiwan is becoming a key focus with Ukraine's wake-up call.
What we saw in the Munich Security Conference is that, yes, there is enormous, I think, support for Taiwan's democracy. I think there is a vested interest by countries around the world, including Europe.
Lastly, we discuss how countries around the world are working together to defeat authoritarianism. Today, we have two guests joining us in the studio. First, we'd like to introduce you Dr. Charles Wu. He is the Associate Professor of the Department of Diplomacy at National Chengchi University. And we have Yurii Poita. He is the head of the new Geopolitics Research Network Asia Section Center for Army Conversion Disarmament Studies based in Ukraine's capital, Kyiv. He is now the visiting research fellow at the Institute for National Defense and Security Research. A warm welcome to both of you.
We also hear later from Hanna Hopko, former Ukrainian MP from Lviv, and Vincent Chao, who just returned from one of the world's largest security conferences. Let's now compare Ukraine with Taiwan. Biden made a surprise visit to Ukraine last week. The president is sending HIMARS and other weapons to support Ukraine. Blinken also said on the anniversary of the invasion that a Taiwan crisis is not an internal Chinese matter.
The world is so concerned about a crisis across the Taiwan Strait is because this is not an internal matter as China would have it, based on its sovereignty. It's a matter of concern to quite literally the entire world.
Professor, is the U.S. and other democratic allies stepping up their support for smaller democracies?
Yeah, we can see that the Ukraine-Russian war has become a prolonged world war. It's already an anniversary. Now, in Europe, the United States still want to maintain their liberal hegemons. However, in East Asia, the United States facing the Chinese challenge. We can see it, obviously.
From China.
From China. So we can see from the, for example, for the 2022 National Security Report, U.S. identified China as America's most consequential geopolitical challenge. Mm-hmm. So if in the future the U.S.-China relations get more intense and Taiwan become a focal point, this is why now a lot of news, a lot of things occur in this area, and people focus on Taiwan.
But does that also translate into more support for Taiwan?
Obviously, for example, we talk about Taiwan Policy Act. United States try to publish, for example, the Senate and the Congress version of the Taiwan Policy Act, and also the NDAA to try to provide Taiwan military support. The most important thing is they try to provide Taiwan an asymmetric warfare system. They try
to training and all that.
Training the missile system to Taiwan. Also, I think this is very important thing is they try to deter the invasion, the potential invasion from China, because if the deterrence failed, and there will probably something occur in the future on the cross-strait relations. Mm-hmm. This is what we need to ask why this is so important, because we can see that if United States fail to maintain this kind of order in the East Asia, and it will create some danger for Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan in the future. So it goes to a very important question is how the United States can cooperate with other allies in this region, especially Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan. And also, if the United States security commitment is strong enough, I think this is very important. So this we can see, no matter Biden, I think he mentioned pledged four times about the potential security support for Taiwan.
With boots on the ground.
Yes, and also last year we can see the Pelosi's visits, and this year they even talk about more cooperation. For example, the Minister of Foreign Affairs Joseph will just visit Washington, D.C. This all create a very important scenario for us to observe in the future. Probably there will more cooperation between Taipei and Washington, D.C. However, this is one very important thing we need to be clear is that this kind of balance of power scenario, whether they can create actually a status quo in the region or the balance of power will move into a more age of war, this is very important and very, very, very dangerous in the future. So I still strongly support that no matter how, we still need to use more diplomatic way rather than only pure military, this kind of what we call balance of power strategy, and to maintain the status quo in this region, especially.
So, Professor, what's behind what Blinken mentioned, that Taiwan is not an internal Chinese matter?
I mean, this is not the first time the United States, Washington D.C. mentioned. You always want to say closer relations or the internal, the Taiwan Strait is not internal water of the.
But it's one that's very bold and very direct, as we've seen, not just the waters.
Yeah, so they try to be very ambiguous. This reminds us we still need to go back to observe and study the Washington's strategic ambiguity policy.
Is there a change in that? Do you feel there's a change?
I don't think there's any change of strategic ambiguity policy. I did research and I also mentioned this several times. It is very dangerous if Washington really want to open the Pandora's box. If they change the strategic ambiguity to a pure strategic clarity. Yeah. And I think all the allies in East Asia, they should get ready. For example, Tokyo should get ready. Seoul need to get ready. Australia and Taiwan also should get ready. However, do they really prepare for potential conflicts in the future against China? I don't think so. A lot of countries still now they try to do the hedging policy. They want to put the different hedging bet between China and the United States. We can talk about this later on. Because I think a potential, they want to maintain a kind of potential peaceful scenario here in East Asia is still their top policy option.
But the timing with Ukraine, how does this fall in? On the anniversary of Ukraine, Blinken mentioned Taiwan.
Yeah, this is interesting because when we study Ukraine war, people are always curious about whether Taiwan will become next Ukraine. And I still say this is a huge differences between Ukraine and Taiwan, especially the Ukraine-Russian war, their power gap, and also China and Taiwan power gap is totally different.
Yeah, different scenarios.
This is a huge asymmetric power between China and China and Taiwan. And if we say, will Taiwan dare to initiate any kind of change of status quo and initiate war against China? Probably not. However, will China step up first and also attack Taiwan? We don't know. But they say if everything crosses a red line, for example, Taiwan declare independence, or there's external external power intervene this Taiwan Strait, probably there is a potential conflicts occur. Yeah. This we need to study though.
We would like to hear the opinion from Kyiv. Yurii, what do you think, and what's your opinion upon what Professor just have said?
Actually, I absolutely agree with Mr. Professor that deterrence should be built not only on the military means, but also very comprehensive, also diplomatic, and then communication, strategic communication, etc. Because the problem was in Ukraine, in terms of Russian-Ukraine war, the strategic deterrence of the NATO and of the US against Russia absolutely failed, because Russian authority didn't know what will be after the invasion. This is the first point. Another point is that Ukraine didn't have so-called collective security. So Ukraine wasn't a member of NATO. So in Russia's belief, firstly, invasion should be very, very easy. So it will be kind of walking through the park in Ukraine.
Easy and fast, right?
Yes,
that's
absolutely.
What they were expecting.
Yeah. So that's why I absolutely agree with Mr. Professor that it should be very comprehensive deterrence system and maybe revising. And but in terms of strategic ambiguity, I'm not very sure, because there are some kind of small indicators that this strategic ambiguity could be changed, because clear statement of President Biden and other representative of the US also could indicate us that there could be some kind of shift.
I see. So speaking of weapon, what Professor just mentioned about, actually Ukrainians are unabated in their fight to protect their homeland, and also President Zelensky continues to ask President of the States, Biden, for F-16 fighter jets. In your opinion, why is the U.S. reluctant to send Ukraine F-16s or other weapons? I
see. So actually, we don't know strategic plan of the Pentagon, right? And Pentagon has an absolutely clear image on the ground, what is going on the battle. So they do have numbers, they do have intelligence, they do have the strategic plans. So for them, it's much better and much easier to plan Ukraine defense, right? This is the first point. Another point is that we don't see any Navy delivery to Ukraine. Maybe there is, it's not timely, I mean, in terms of delivering some ships, warships, etc. So what I think that F-16 for the time being, it's not crucial for Ukrainian victory. It could strengthen Ukraine defense, especially air defense and missile defense as well. It could help in terms of deoccupying Ukraine territory. But at the time being, it's not crucial thing. And the US and NATO now is focusing on other means. For instance, artillery, HIMARS, tanks, and tank coalition already was built, and other heavy weapon. Maybe, and I do believe that F-16 now is under a very deep discussion, but it's not timely for the time being.
Was there any possibility that it's from fear of escalating the war?
Actually, I don't think so.
Okay.
Because we do see that how escalation, so-called escalation, is going on. So for the time being, Russia uses all means of its armed forces, despite nuclear means, nukes. But you know, this Russian nuclear, how to say, blackmail was very effective. But we do understand when we will follow them, their nuclear blackmail, we also could, you know, kind of make a cession. So we could give up also under the pressure of nuclear blackmail. So I do believe that this Russian messages of possible usage nuclear means still relevant in NATO, maybe in the US, but it doesn't connect with the F-16 directly.
I wanted to ask from a Ukrainian perspective, do you feel Taiwan is effectively deterring China with the steps before, as with Ukraine went to war? Do you feel that Taiwan and the US and Western allies are actually effectively deterring China at this point?
Actually, I'm not an expert on Taiwan Strait, so my knowledge on the situation, cross-Taiwan Strait relation is very limited. But we do see in history, and during the history, Taiwan wasn't invaded. You know, after 1979, this act, etc. So it means it could indicate that this strategic deterrence was very, very effective. But we do see that Chinese military power is rising, right? So, and they are building up very effectively, very intensively, building up their capabilities. Also capabilities that should help them to invade Taiwan in terms of Marine Corps, in terms of nuclear power as well. And we should understand what lesson China learns from Russian-Ukraine war and what particular conclusion China does from this war. So that's why I do believe that for the time being, strategic deterrence against China of Taiwan is working, but it doesn't mean that it shouldn't be improved because landscape is changing. China is becoming stronger, and maybe that aspect that worked in the past will not work in the future. So it's kind of ongoing process, I believe.
So you don't believe Taiwan is in what Ukraine was in 2014 with Crimea and...
I'm not sure that I could draw parallel between Taiwan and now and Ukraine, Crimea annexation, etc. But we do see that China is preparing for that. We don't know if it really going to invade, but at least China prepares some means and you know, military power, etc. And China also has very kind of aggressive rhetoric in their media, in their statements, etc. So they are going to use military method to so-called to make this reunification, so-called reunification this Taiwan. So there are some parallels. So I don't exclude the possible scenario also here. But I couldn't, you know, I cannot forecast because we should know much more information of Chinese readiness and also on the other things.
I see. So actually on the other side of the table of military is diplomacy, right? Just from Professor what you mentioned. We see Wang Yi, the top diplomat of China, just made his visit to Russia. And also we can see that Xi Jinping also just welcomed one of the America's top advisors, the Iranian president, to Beijing. So Professor, do you think China is picking up sides, obviously?
I think this is an interesting question raised by a lot of people, scholars, think tanks, and
people are watching.
Yeah, they are saying whether China will pick sides, why China, they don't kind of, you know, announce their positions, or they trying
to be vague but
obvious. And also
Washington
mentioned that China probably will provide military weapons to Russia.
However,
we can use several levels to analyze the China-Russia relations. For example, from an individual level. Xi and Putin, they have kind of close relations. If I remember correctly, 2013, when Xi came to power, he visited Putin. And during the conversation, Xi mentioned, you and I, we are close friends. And since then, they maintain frequent and very close conversation with each other. And people say probably there are no other leaders like Xi met with Putin.
So it in fact is a no-limits relationship.
Yeah, this is provide another scenario we can discuss. I can tell you another thing. If you remember correctly, 2017 in Kazakhstan, there's a meeting between China and Russia. At the time, Putin and all the team, the diplomatic team, his think tank, they sit down and prepare well. And Xi was alone because I think there's a misarrangements between the conversation. Okay. And at that time, Putin made a joke. He said, look, he's a lone warrior. he looked at Xi and said, look at it, lone warrior. Who can make a joke against Xi? Only Putin. And you can see, and I think some probably people video that, tape that, and put on the YouTube. So you can see they have the two, the leader, they have this kind of a close relationship. They can make jokes against each other. Yeah. So this is why we can, from the individual level. From the state level, China and Russia, they have this kind of, we call strategic partnership. They don't call allies because China, they don't have the ally strategy. They don't want to make alliances. However, there's strategic partnership. And if you remember correctly, in 2022, before the Winter Olympic game, Xi and Putin, they met. And they have a joint announcement. They say what? China and Russia, they don't have limited friendship. Means their relationship is unlimited. And they also announced that they will hold hand in hand to what? To counterbalance against external influences, which means for the United States. So after their announcements, the Ukraine war occurred. So people will doubt what they made or what they discussed during the conversation.
So you feel it's a Chinese endorsement of the Russian invasion?
I don't know. I don't want to guess or predict. But if they had a conversation during that, any kind of conversation during the meeting, and then the war occurs, probably there are some cultural influences between them.
It's interesting you mentioned that. I wanted to ask Yurii, because China did come out and propose a ceasefire, which obviously from scholars, they say that it benefits Russia and disadvantages Ukraine. What are your thoughts on that and the Ukrainian view on China?
So actually, it's not a new, absolutely, because just after the full-scale invasion, China already proposed so-called 5-point plan or five-point position on Ukraine crisis. It was on 26th of February last year. And then it was other kind of peaceful plan or something like that.
So we just spoke about how Ukrainian and Taiwanese are fending against authoritarian aggression. So coming up next, we will be hearing from Hanna Hopko on the unwavering fighting spirit of the Ukrainian people.
Let's now hear from Hanna Hopko from Lviv, Ukraine. Hanna is the chairwoman for Democracy in Action and a former member of parliament and head of the Committee of Foreign Affairs at the Ukrainian Parliament. She tells me about how Ukrainians are confident in winning and how her country is working with Taiwan. Let's take a look. Hanna, it's been a year since the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Can you talk about how Ukraine is holding up?
After a year of full-scale genocidal war against Ukraine, we have to remind the world that Russia invaded Ukraine in 2014 by illegal annexation of Crimea. And of course, after February 24 last year, Ukraine proved that we are so strong, so Russian plan to occupy Ukraine within 72 hours or within several days failed. And actually, Russia is losing and Russia will be defeated in Ukraine because of support of Western democracies and support of the whole world. And I think this is the key lessons that Putin and Russian totalitarian regime must learn, that we will not surrender, we will not cede or trade our territories. And Ukrainians, more than 90%, believe that we are winning and we must win. And this is our mission, to defeat Russian imperialism. And this is the key for global democracy.
You spoke about lessons for Russia. What can Taiwan learn also from the determination of the Ukrainian people?
So I think victory of Ukraine is victory of democracy. It's geopolitical actuality of Ukraine defeating Russia faster is so important not to allow the authoritarian regimes, because it's not just Russia fighting against Ukrainians, killing our civilians by massive cruise missile and kamikaze drones attacks. Besides Russia, there is also Belarusian regime, Lukashenko regime. It's Iran supporting or supplying kamikaze drones to Russia. It's China. It's North Korea. So this is why I think for Taiwan, they have to learn from Ukrainian resilience of our society, and also to work with local communities like we did before the full-scale escalation, building territorial defense and also countering Russian propaganda and not allowing Russia, the enemy, to use media, churches, politicians against us, against our independence. So I think it's really important that never be afraid that you might lose, because this was what Russia expected, that Russia is so big, the second largest army, and we will just surrender. No, I think it's important your spirit, and the fighting spirit of Ukraine is so high. So this is why I think Russia miscalculated. They miscalculated our readiness to fight and our desire to win.
Fighting spirit, indeed. Can you talk about a bit where you're at now?
We have such stickers: гуманітарна допомога для перемоги України. Humanitarian aid for victory of Ukraine, for Ukrainian victory. And here you could see the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Republic of Taiwan and logos of civil society organizations like Forestcom, ANTS. This is how Taiwanese government and Taiwanese people are helping Ukraine during this winter, because Russia wanted to freeze Ukrainians by deliberately attacking and destroying critical energy infrastructure. So everything you see here, from energy cookies, also for all staff not to get freeze. So this is really important. I can show you all these boxes and volunteers behind me, which are now going to Donetsk region, Ukrainian people in local communities, people who lost their homes. And it's really important to see here different gloves and different stuff that will help us to win. And after cold winter, the spring of hope will come. And I think it's really important that Taiwan helped Ukraine a lot already, and Taiwan supported Ukraine by providing humanitarian aid, financial support. And I think this is a good ground for future partnership, and partnership in security areas, in increasing our economic and trade potential, and opening official offices or representative offices in Ukraine and in Taipei.
How do you feel Taiwan and Ukraine can work together going forward?
Taiwan and Ukraine already are working together, but after victory, I think it's important that Taiwan is taking part in reconstruction efforts, helping Ukraine with new technologies, sharing your experience in different sectors, and also working on education, because your Minister of Digital Affairs, Audrey Tan, already started cooperation in digital sphere, and also working with Ukrainian universities. I think we have to think about the future and invest in our efforts in introducing our young generations to each other, because there are many Ukrainian students. When I visited Taipei, and we went to Hsinchu Science Park, and we met several Ukrainians. So I think democracy like-minded countries, they have unite efforts also in critical technologies development, exchanging their knowledge for protection democracy, and not allowing authoritarian regime to undermine our efforts.
You just heard from Hanna Hopko speak to Rath about how Ukraine is winning and how Taiwan is playing a part of that. So actually, as Hanna showed us earlier, Ukraine is facing freezing winter right now, and many are saying that much of the fighting won't resume until it gets warmer in the spring. Yurii, do you agree, or do you think what can be the winning strategy for Ukraine currently?
So basically, Ukraine, of course, and Ukrainian civilians are suffering a lot,
Right.
especially during the winter period due to this kind of, how to say, Russian missile attack against Ukrainian critical infrastructure. And it was an absolutely new tactic of Russian, because when they failed to defeat Ukraine on the battlefield, they just switched to the civilians and trying to launch a massive attack during one day, about 100 missile attack against Ukrainian critical infrastructure. But their calculation also failed. Ukraine's society is very, very much, has very huge level of morale, and now winter is going to end. So that means that Russia failed this plan, strategic plan. In terms of how to build Ukrainian defense better, there are of course different dimensions. So military dimensions, defense dimensions, and the Ukraine Ministry of Defense now is very, very actively working on that in terms of getting more tanks, more artillery weaponry, more other things, asymmetric weaponry, etc., and training Ukrainian soldiers according to the NATO standards, because it gives them a huge superiority, huge advantage over the Russian. And also there are lots of things that should be done in terms of diplomatic, in terms of pressure on Russia, in terms of making sanctions more effective, more severe, etc. So there is kind of comprehensive strategy should be implemented.
Going 1 year, how long do you feel this will prolong into?
It's impossible to say, actually, because we don't have a full scale of information what is going on the battlefield, and what is condition of Russian armed forces, what is condition of Ukrainian armed forces, etc. Because this information is very sensitive, and could, the lack of this information could give advantage for another side. So, but as we see in our think tanks, we still have cautious optimism that Ukraine could, and Ukraine really has a chance to liberate its already occupied territory, and Ukraine is very, very desperate to do it, and very determined to do it. And Ukraine's government is very much connected with society and with armed forces, and the huge level of morale is one of the key priority of this victory. So actually we are going to win this war. We cannot forecast what will be and what so-called black swans could appear in terms of, for instance, Chinese assessment, etc.
Yeah.
But we do planning to win this war this year.
Indeed, morale is over 90%, as Hanna mentioned.
Yeah.
Speaking of Chinese, and Professor, I wanted to ask you about what are China's motives with the war in Ukraine? Is it to distract the U.S.? What do you feel China wants out of this conflict?
Yeah, this is a good question. Like, why China is sending out those kind of mixed message?
Yeah.
We should not forget. Even we talk about there's no limited friendship between China and Russia, but in history, both those countries, they had conflicts. They had issue on the border.
Yeah.
If we remember correctly, there's a Zhenbaodao Island incidents. In Russia, it's called the Mansky Island. So during Mao Zedong and even Deng Xiaoping, they are have very special relation with Russia. Okay. However, if you look at China and Ukraine is a major weapon supplier to China and also agricultural products to China. So China has both good relation with Ukraine and Russia. This is why Beijing try to be ambiguous and sending a mixed message. Okay.
So it does seem like it has already picked sides with Russia because of its size or because of
This is one thing we need to talk, because John Mearsheimer mentioned very correctly. Okay, it's a very, he wants to say bad or stupid strategy for Washington to push China's side to Russia. If you look at the history, the triangular relationship between Russia, China, and the United States, why during the Nixon administration they want to normalize the relation with China? Because they want to use Beijing to against Russia. Yeah, and now Washington, if you put China to the Russia, you are kind of engaged in this kind of, we call the potential war trap in Europe. So this is one thing we're going to talk is, if we use social network analysis, we call enemies my friend. If you are Beijing, you look at enemies my friend, so they will have a kind of stable relation with Moscow. And they will use this kind of position to counter against Washington in the future. So how Washington, they can wisely manage this scenario, I think this is not a kind of immediate or quick decision they can make. It's a prolonged diplomacy they need to handle.
But does this also mean Taiwan, that as a fellow democracy, it brings democracies closer, as you see with Ukraine, with the US, and pronounced support for Taiwan? Do you feel, in the context of Taiwan, it's actually good for Taiwan?
This also goes back to a very important study. We talk about democracy, okay? Why democracy is so important? Because first, democracy, they have better governance. Second, democracy, they are easy to have friends, make friends with each other. Democracy are more likely
share
to
values and
share
systems.
value and make alliances with each other, right? And when we study democratic peace theory, democracy don't fight a war against democracy. And this is why now Biden administration, he used the hub and spoke system. They try to bring a democratic ally together using this kind of, we call the same value country and work together.
So what's the hub in Asia, you feel?
A hub, seriously, is the United States. Washington is the hub. And the spoke is the Japan, US allies, Japan, South Korea allies, and probably in the potential.
And does Japan delegate to Taiwan, or do you feel Washington directly delegates to Taiwan?
This is a, rising question we need to study. The Japan, US, and Taiwan, the triangular relationship, how far they can go, how far further they can develop is very important, okay? And now I can see a lot of conversation between the three sides, academic, from military, from intelligence. There's a lot of things going on right now. So I want to say, realists, they are right, okay? If we, we focus on ideology, we focus on this balance of power. In the future, East Asia will get into, we call these conflicts or the age of war scenario.
But going back to the elephant in the room, how do you prevent a second Ukraine in Taiwan, in Asia?
This is why I say, if you look at human history, we are cooperation, between cooperation and conflicts. It's a mix of cooperation and conflicts. This is why we study human history is a war history, right? So people say probably we'll experience another big war in the future. And probably Ukraine war will be a kind of starting point if they cannot handle correctly and safely. If we put, use ideology as a kind of factors, putting, split the two sides. One is called democracy, one autocracies, and then start to form alliances. The Cold War probably will come, or we call the new Cold War. Probably Huntington is right, clash of civilizations.
Oh, Yurii, do you feel it already started? Cold War 2.0?
I do think so, actually. So there is kind of the end of the era of cooperation, maybe, right? The end of the era is of communication between different countries. So it's still continuing, but we do see kind of crystallization, right? So between this country, and they are more willing to take side, right? So I do think that this process is kind of major trend. I'm not sure that it is inevitable, but it seems to be, for me, this kind of Cold War already started, and Ukraine, this Russian invasion against Ukraine could be, kind of trigger in other region of the war. It very much depends on the result of the Russian-Ukraine war.
Okay, so Yurii, how's the way Ukrainians look at China right now? As current speaking.
So there are absolutely different views on China.
Right.
So according to our documents that we signed with China, China is a strategic partner. Since 2011, China is a strategic partner with Ukraine. In 2013, it was
military-wise and food-wise, right?
It's so officially it is a strategic partnership.
Okay.
It means that Ukraine and China could cooperate in different areas, especially in sensitive areas, right? Military technical cooperation, maybe
Right.
what is the result, what is connected to the critical infrastructure, some sensitive information, etc. But for the time being, in Ukraine, views on China is very, very much changing. So for the time being, a huge discussion already started in expert community, in media, in parliament, and now,
2 years,
yes, and it passed to government. So for the time being, Ukraine is reconsidering its relation with China, because we do understand that so-called strategic partnership with China actually failed. So Ukraine tries to find out absolutely new model how to cooperate with China, maybe based on the approaches that NATO has and European Union has and the strategic allies has. So this is an ongoing process now.
I see. So we just discussed Russian and Chinese authoritarian ambitions. Coming up next, we hear from Vincent Chao on how Ukraine has made Taiwan a top security priority for Western democracies.
Vincent Chao is a Taipei City Councilor and is an expert in U.S.-Taiwan ties and the region's security. Vincent was formerly Political Division Director of Taiwan's mission to the United States. Chao is also a fellow at the Asia Program and China Power Project at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and recently represented Taiwan at the Munich Security Conference. Let's hear what he has to say. Vincent, it's been a year since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Have you seen more support for Ukraine in the past year?
We've seen democracies around the world come together in support of Ukraine, not only in the security sphere, but also the economic sphere, the humanitarian support sphere, and certainly in terms of international support as well, including through international bodies. And so I think it really does show the power of democracies. I mean, Ukraine from the get-go has been a symbol and an inspiration to democracies around the world, standing on the front lines of this conflict that authoritarian regimes have with freedom-loving peoples. And so I think we've seen sort of not only the United States take the lead, but also countries in Europe, especially in the eastern flank, especially in Central and Eastern Europe, really see this invasion of Ukraine as an invasion on their own ideals and their own values and principles. And so I think in addition to what we've seen recently in terms of the tanks, I fully expect that we will see a robust discussion over provisions of F-16s in the near future. And that's in addition to everything, all the sophisticated weaponry we've seen sort of in the last few months, including HIMARS, including other precision strike munitions and so forth. And so there has been conferences and pledges, I think, not only in Europe, but other democracies around the world to think about ways of not only financing, but actually providing expertise to rebuild Ukraine after this war is over. We've seen, for example, countries, including Poland, but also other countries such as Germany, Austria, and so forth. I think there are people that say, democracy, it's a very vague concept. I think what we've seen over the past few months is it's not a vague concept. It's a very strong concept, and it's a concept that has brought a lot of tangibility to Ukraine, and I fully expect that these types of support will continue as time goes by.
Just coming back from the Munich Security Conference representing Taiwan, Vincent, what have you seen in terms of parallels drawn between Taiwan?
I think there's a lot of similarities, but there's also a lot of differences between Taiwan and Ukraine, and certainly our geopolitical position is a bit different. I mean, we're an island. I think we have robust self-defense capabilities. I think there's a understanding, I think, that Taiwan's security is directly correlated with the security of the Indo-Pacific region and to the United States. And so in that respect, I think Taiwan does enjoy some advantages that Ukraine in the past has not seen. With that being said, however, there is enormous similarities as well, and both of us face authoritarian neighbor, and both of us struggle with this neighbor presenting an existentialist crisis, I think, to the existence of our countries. And so to that respect, what we saw in the Munich Security Conference is that, yes, there is enormous, I think, support for Taiwan's democracy. I think there is a vested interest by countries around the world, including Europe, to support the maintenance of peace and security across the Taiwan Strait. I think what I would personally like to see a little more of is the Europeans focusing and bringing forward a bit more resources on European security and allowing the United States to focus a little bit more on Indo-Pacific security. So, I do think there should be a more clear division of labor to say, but at the same time, that's not to say the United States should not be invested in Ukrainian defense. The Europeans should not be invested in Taiwan's defense. I think quite the contrary. I think it is incumbent on all of us, including countries in Europe and the US, to find the best ways of ensuring peace and stability anywhere in the world.
Taiwan, as a fellow democracy, can it do more for Ukraine? How do you feel both countries can cooperate going forward?
I think we've been fairly helpful on Ukraine. I think compared to many other East Asian countries, I think Taiwan is right up at the top there in terms of the assistance we've provided, not only through official channels, but also through civil society and NGOs. And I fully expect that this sort of assistance will continue. We've seen rallies for Ukraine here in Taiwan that have been well attended by politicians of all political stripes. And I think that goes to show that it is really a bipartisan issue, and hopefully it continues to be a bipartisan issue here in Taiwan. In terms of what more we can do, I think we continue to be acute to the needs of Ukrainians, particularly as we're currently in winter now. And so I'm pleased to see we've donated power generators and other equipment. I think we'll continue to be acute to their needs after spring and after hopefully the war is won sometime in the near future. And so I think Taiwan can play a pivotal part in the rebuilding, particularly of IT infrastructure, of new and emerging industries and so forth. At the same time, I do think that caution has to be exercised in terms of the Taiwan-Ukrainian relationship, only in the sense that we understand that Ukraine is in a very precarious state right now. And certainly, I think it's in nobody's interest to get China further involved in supporting Russia. So, I think that the development of our, Ukrainian-Taiwan relationship, has to be very circumspect in the sense that we certainly want to do what is best for Ukraine. So, I do think there's a lot of ways we can move forward on this relationship economically, in terms of humanitarian assistance, in terms of rebuilding assistance. And I'm fully, I fully believe that Taiwan is committed on each of these fronts.
You just heard Vincent Chao speak to Rath about the steep boost in support for Taiwan's security since Russia invaded Ukraine. So actually, at the same time of Munich Security Conference, China also conducted a 10-day joint Navy exercise with Russia and South Africa. Professor, the question goes to you. How do you see this democracy versus autocracy military competition pan out so far?
The democracy and autocracy competition is a very, very interesting, because we look at the academic arguments. Democracy, they don't fight a war against each other. However, democracy and autocracy, they fight like cats and dogs. If you look at history, all the conflict and war happened between one democracy and one autocracy. Yeah. And why? Because first, they share different values. Second, they have different strategic thinkings. Democracy, they are transparent to each other. However, autocracies, they are not transparent. So if you have this kind of scenario, when democracy want to initiate fight, they want to fight a quick and must-winning war. Okay, why? Because democracy, they have a check and balance systems in there.
And always negotiating.
Always negotiate, and they are hesitate to initiate war if they cannot win. So, but like I said, democracy, they have an upper hand on everything. If we look at data, democracy have better economic growth. Democracy have the better governance. They have even better anti-corruption system and rule of law. Okay, so if you throw the indicator of democracy into all the statistics models, all significant with other things.
So you're saying in the long run, democracy will win?
But I'm not saying that, because if you look at competitions, okay, it's a lot of things we need to see whether who can fight a prolonged war, who has a stronger capability, who has stronger army. However, like what I say, democracy, they have check and balance system in the state, in their domestic politics. If they have a prolonged war, they cannot guarantee a war to win, they will face a lot of challenge from domestic. Look at the United States, right? The United States have faced a prolonged war in Saigon, in Afghanistan. And now, if the United States want to engage with European continents, Ukraine war, they must make sure the check and balance system in their domestic politics support a United States to fight a prolonged war like this. So, however, like what I say, I don't know if we put the democracy and the autocracy into some kind of model of military competition, who will win more? Probably we can do this study. But like what I say, democracy, they are performing better on several aspects, but they be very, very careful about the domestic politics.
I think you mentioned a great point, because if you look at Ukraine, Biden has been hesitant in terms of sending boots on the ground. But for Taiwan, he said differently. What is behind that?
Like I say, Taiwan, we are a democratic system. Okay, we have very similar values.
But Ukraine is also a democracy.
Yes, we are democratic system. We share similar values. We have very close relation with the United States and other European or Asian democracies. So it's easy for us to cooperate. Why? Because we pay attention and emphasize the rule of law. Okay, we pay attention to social contract. So this is why democracy, that we are more easy to cooperate with democracy. Look at the Cold War. During the Cold War, there are very clear cuts between democracy and autocracy. Only democracy, they form coalitions. They cooperate with each other securely or in economics. They cannot trade to the different camps, right? So now, if we are moving to this kind of trend, democracy try to form a group of, kind of coalition, and autocracy. I don't know whether Iran, China, Russia, or North Korea, they are trying to recall the evil empire in the future. I don't want to see this one happens. However, if Samuel Huntington is correct, clash of civilizations, or we are really moving toward to this trend, then we need to get ready. Okay? Probably it's not a bad thing because a Cold War is actually it was really cold because they have nuclear deterrence. They have mutual destructive capabilities.
That's the future we don't want to see, actually. Yeah.
Yeah, this is how human beings we need to be smart.
Yeah.
Right. So this is why in Washington, people always they argue and debate to each other whether United States diplomacy they are correct or they have made a wrong decision for the Indian history because. If you read the Stephen Wall book, The Hell of Good Intentions, because they say, United States want to maintain liberal hegemony in the world, however, they made so many mistakes. But in Washington, D.C., no one tried to point out there still be mistakes. Even their scholars, their think tanks, their kind of politicians, they try to protect their positions, but no one really wants to say they are making wrong things.
Speaking of D.C., Yurii, do you feel the U.S. is doing enough for both Ukraine and Taiwan?
Yeah, to conclude the show today.
So actually, I do believe that US and also NATO and European Union are doing very, very, very much. And we're extremely grateful for their assistance, for their help, etc. Because it was very difficult to change their position, to change their mind, because they just was very, very national interested, based on their national interest. But now they realize that this Russian aggression and Russian expansion, or this war between democracy and autocracy, could lead to completely, kind of complete collapse of their system, right? It could undermine their position. And if they will not invest in Ukraine, if they don't invest in Taiwan security as well, it could lead to the absolutely, kind of disaster in the world. And then they will feel they will fail this Cold War, and then it could be kind of hot war. So I do believe that US and the European Union and West are doing their best. But of course, there is still a huge potential that could be developed in terms of how fast they do, how sophisticated they do it, and how comprehensive in terms of economy, in terms of diplomacy, sanction, strategic deterrence, military capabilities, and also taking leadership, because leadership is crucial here. And the lack of the leadership during this period before this full-scale war was one of the aspects that led to this Russian invasion. So leadership now is one of the key priority, I believe, for everyone.
Thank you, Yurii. Thank you, Professor, for sharing your thoughts with us.
We just talked about how similar yet different Ukraine and Taiwan are as democracies boost support against authoritarian expansionism. Let us know in the YouTube comment section if you believe the US will send troops to help Taiwan in a cross-strait conflict. Also, if you like our shows, please subscribe to the Taiwan Talks YouTube channel at Taiwan Talks 2022.
Thank you for staying with us. Stay safe. See you next time.